What would you do if in one single night you lost your job, your home, and your last shred of hope all at the same time? This is the true story of a woman named Grace and the mysterious stranger who walked into her life and changed everything. Grace Miller was 32 years old, and she had already lived through more pain than most people face in a lifetime. She was raising her 8-year-old daughter Emma alone in a tiny apartment above a hardware store in Millfield, Ohio, a town so small that if you blinked while driving through, you would miss it entirely. Every night, Grace tied on her apron and walked 2 blocks to the Maple Cafe, the only 24-hour diner in town, where she worked the graveyard shift from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. The tips were thin and the coffee was always burnt, but it was enough to keep the lights on and food on Emma's plate. Grace had not always lived like this. She grew up in a church-going family and married her high school sweetheart at 21. But he left when Emma was 2 and never looked back. No forwarding address, no child support, just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm sorry," as if 2 words could cover the wreckage he left behind. Grace kept going because that is what mothers do. She worked doubles. She skipped meals so Emma could eat. She smiled when she wanted to scream. But on this particular Thursday night in October, the sky opened up with the worst storm Millfield had seen in a decade. And so did Grace's world. It started with a phone call at 9:15. Emma had collapsed at the babysitter's house with severe abdominal pain, appendicitis, emergency surgery. Grace raced to the hospital and held her daughter's hand until they wheeled her through the double doors. The surgery went well, but the bill would not. $14,000 with no insurance. Grace was still sitting in the waiting room in shock when her phone buzzed again. A voicemail from her landlord. 3 months behind on rent. Eviction proceedings starting Monday. Then 1 more call. Her manager at the Maple Cafe. Budget cuts. Her position was being eliminated at the end of the week. Grace drove to the diner that night for her final shifts and sat alone in the empty restaurant at 2 in the morning, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. The neon sign outside flickered in the storm. She put her head in her hands, and for the first time in years, she spoke to God out loud. If you are real, if you are listening, please show me a way. I cannot do this alone anymore. I have nothing left. The diner was silent. The storm raged on, and Grace had no idea that her prayer was already being answered, walking toward her through the rain. Have you ever met someone for just a few minutes and felt like they could see straight through to your soul? It was almost 3 in the morning when the bell above the diner door jingled. Grace wiped her eyes quickly and looked up. A man stepped inside, dripping wet from head to toe. He was in his late 60s, with deep lines carved into a face that had clearly seen its share of hard years. He wore a faded military jacket, the kind you see at veterans' thrift stores, and his silver hair was plastered flat against his forehead from the rain. He moved slowly, not from weakness, but from the kind of deliberate calm that comes with a man who is exactly where he means to be. He slid into the corner booth and folded his hands on the table. "Just a black coffee, please, ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet and steady, like a river that knows where it is going. Grace poured the coffee and set it down in front of him. Something about this man made her pause. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not through her the way most late-night customers did, but directly at her, as if she were the only person in the world who mattered in that moment. He reminded her of her father, the same quiet strength, the same kind eyes that seemed to carry both sorrow and peace at the same time. Her father had passed away 6 years ago, and there were days when his absence felt like a missing wall in a house, everything just slightly exposed to the weather. Grace went back to the kitchen and saw the last slice of apple pie sitting under the glass dome. It was meant for the morning display, but something moved in her heart. She warmed it up, added a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and brought it to the old man's table. "On the house," she said. "Nobody should be out on a night like this without something warm." The man looked at the pie and then looked up at her, and his eyes glistened. "That is very kind of you, Grace," he said. She froze. She had not told him her name. Her name tag was in her locker. She had taken it off an hour ago. "How do you know my name?" she asked. The man smiled gently, the way someone smiles when they know something beautiful that you have not discovered yet. "I know more than your name," he said softly. "I know you prayed tonight, and I want you to know that he heard you. Every single word." Before Grace could respond, the man stood up, buttoned his wet jacket, and walked toward the door. "Wait," she called out. "Who are you?" He turned and said simply, "My name is William. And Grace, do not be afraid. What is coming for you is so much bigger than what has been taken from you." Then he stepped into the storm and disappeared into the darkness, as if the rain had swallowed him whole. What if the answer to your most desperate prayer was sitting right in front of you, and you almost missed it? Grace stood at the door, staring into the empty parking lot for a full minute. The rain poured down, but there was no sign of William. No car pulling away, no figure walking down the road. He was simply gone, as if he had never been there at all. She turned back to clean up his table, and that is when she saw it. A leather Bible, old and thick and deeply worn, sitting on the booth seat where William had been. She grabbed it and ran outside again, calling his name into the storm. Nothing. Just wind and rain and the sound of her own voice echoing off empty buildings. She came back inside dripping wet and sat down in the booth, still warm from where he had sat. She opened the Bible carefully. The leather was soft from years of handling, the pages thin and yellowed with age, covered in handwritten notes in the margins. Verses were underlined and circled. Entire passages were highlighted. This was not a decoration. This was a Bible that had been lived in. She turned to a page that had been marked with a small piece of folded paper. It was Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" Next to the verse, in the same careful handwriting that filled the margins, was a note. "Grace Miller, God has prepared things for you that you cannot yet imagine. Trust Him." Her hands began to shake. This man had known her name. He had known about her prayer. And he had left a message written specifically for her, inside a Bible she had never seen before. Then she noticed the envelope. It was tucked into the back cover, sealed with no markings on the outside. She opened it, and her breath left her body. Inside was cash. She counted it twice because she could not believe it the first time. It was exactly $14,000, the precise amount of Emma's surgery bill, down to the dollar. A small note was folded inside with the money. "This is only the beginning. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, go to St. Mark's Church on Elm Street. What you are looking for is waiting there." Grace pressed the Bible against her chest and sobbed. She did not understand what was happening. She did not know how any of this was possible. But for the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of: hope. Have you ever walked into a place for the first time and felt like you were finally coming home? Grace barely slept that night. She lay in bed next to Emma, who was recovering beautifully from surgery, and stared at the ceiling, turning everything over in her mind. Who was William? How did he know her name? How could the money be the exact amount? And what was waiting for her at St. Mark's Church? She had driven past that church 1,000 times. It was a small white building with a tall steeple and a wooden sign out front that always had a different Bible verse each week. She had never been inside. By 9:45 the next morning, Grace was standing on the sidewalk across the street, staring at the front door of St. Mark's Church. Her heart was pounding. Part of her wanted to turn around and go home. The rational part of her brain was screaming that this was crazy, that she was following instructions from a stranger she met at 3 in the morning during a thunderstorm. but something deeper than logic pulled her forward. She climbed the steps and opened the door. The inside was warm and smelled like old wood and candle wax. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows and painted the floor in patches of gold and blue and red. A man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle smile was standing in the foyer as if he had been waiting for her. "You must be Grace," he said. "I'm Pastor David Thompson, and this is my wife, Martha." Martha stepped forward and wrapped Grace in a hug before she could even respond. "We have been praying for you," Martha whispered. Grace pulled back, confused. "I don't understand. How do you know who I am?" Pastor David smiled. "Last night around midnight, a man came to our door. He said his name was William. He told us that God was sending someone to our church in the morning, someone with a gift for feeding people, someone with a heart for service, and that we needed to be ready. He described you perfectly." Grace's knees went weak. Pastor David continued, "Grace, for the past 6 months, we have been trying to start a community kitchen. This town has too many hungry people and too many lonely people, and we believe God's house should be the place where both problems are solved. But we could not find anyone to run it. We needed someone with professional cooking experience and a servant's heart. We have a fully equipped commercial kitchen in the back of this church, and a salary budgeted for a full-time coordinator." He told her the number. Grace had to ask him to repeat it. It was enough to cover her rent, her bills, and Emma's ongoing medical costs, with room to breathe for the first time in years. Martha took her hand and led her to the back of the church. When she opened the kitchen door, Grace saw gleaming stainless steel counters, commercial ovens, industrial refrigerators, everything a professional cook could dream of. "This is yours if you want it," Martha said. Grace stood in that doorway and felt something break open inside her chest. 24 hours ago, she had been sitting in an empty diner begging God for a way forward. And now here she was, standing in the middle of his answer. What happens when one act of kindness starts a chain reaction that transforms an entire town? Grace started the community kitchen the following Thursday, and she poured everything she had into it. She arrived at the church at 6 every morning to prep. She made soups and casseroles and fresh bread and the kind of hearty meals that fill not just your stomach, but your soul. She set the tables with real plates and cloth napkins because she believed that every person who walked through those doors deserved to feel like an honored guest, not a charity case. Word spread fast in a town like Millfield. By the second week, the Thursday kitchen was serving over 60 people. By the end of the first month, that number had doubled. Families came. Elderly couples who had been eating alone for years came. Teenagers with nowhere else to go came. Single fathers and struggling veterans and people who had not had a home-cooked meal in months all found their way to that church basement. But it was not just about the food. Something else was happening. People who had been strangers for years were sitting across from each other and talking. Walls were coming down. Loneliness was losing its grip. The kitchen became the living room of the entire town, a place where everyone belonged and no one was turned away. It was on the 5th Thursday that Grace had her most stunning revelation. She was ladling soup into a bowl for an elderly man named Frank when she suddenly recognized him. Frank used to come into the Maple Cafe every Tuesday night. He always ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and nursed it for hours because he had nowhere else to go. Grace had made a habit of accidentally making his portions too large and slipping an extra roll onto his plate when the manager was not looking. She never thought anything of it. Now here was Frank sitting in her kitchen, being served by 3 volunteers who had all told Grace the same story. Each of them had once been on the receiving end of a small kindness that someone in this town had shown them, and they wanted to pay it forward. Grace looked around the room, and the truth hit her like a wave. The free pie she gave to strangers, the extra portions she snuck to lonely customers, the smiles she offered when she was too tired to feel them herself. None of it had been wasted. God had been collecting every single seed she had planted in the dark. And now He was showing her the harvest. Galatians chapter 6 verse 9 says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Grace had not given up, and the harvest was more beautiful than anything she could have planted on her own. Sometimes God lets you stand at the edge of the impossible, just so you can watch Him do what only He can do. Everything was going so well that Grace should have known a storm was coming. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in February. She got the call at 1:15. Emma had collapsed at school. Severe allergic reaction. Unknown cause. By the time Grace reached the hospital, Emma was unconscious, and her small body was covered in hives. Her breathing was labored, and her blood pressure was dropping. The doctors ran test after test, but nothing came back conclusive. They stabilized her, but could not figure out what was attacking her system. Hours passed. Then a full day. Emma's condition was not improving. The doctors looked more worried with each visit, and their answers became shorter and vaguer. Grace sat beside Emma's bed, holding her daughter's small hand and watching the monitors beep and flash. This was supposed to be their new beginning. God had provided the job. He had provided the money. He had sent William. Everything had pointed to a life of restoration and purpose. And now her baby girl was lying in a hospital bed, and no one could tell her why. At 2 a.m, Grace left Emma's bedside and walked down the empty hospital corridor to the chapel. It was a small room with a few wooden pews, a single candle, and a stained glass window that caught the hallway light in faint colors. She fell to her knees on the cold floor and prayed the way she had prayed that night in the diner. Raw, desperate, holding nothing back. God, I trusted you. I believed you had a plan. Please do not take my daughter. She is all I have. She is everything. She was still on her knees when a nurse appeared in the chapel doorway. "Are you Grace Miller?" the nurse asked. "There is someone here to see you." Grace walked to the waiting room and stopped. There, sitting calmly in a plastic chair as if he had been there for hours, was William. He was wearing the same faded military jacket, but this time there was a hospital identification badge clipped to his pocket. "William," Grace whispered, "what are you doing here?" He stood and took both of her hands in his. "I am here because I am supposed to be. Now take me to your daughter." William walked into Emma's room, studied her charts, examined her carefully with the practiced hands of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Within 20 minutes, he identified what the other doctors had missed: a rare autoimmune response triggered by a combination of medications. He recommended a specific treatment protocol. The attending physician confirmed it, and within 6 hours, Emma's vitals began to stabilize. By morning, she was awake and asking for her mother. Grace sank into the chair beside Emma's bed. Her daughter's fingers wrapped around hers and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." What happens when one woman's story of faith becomes a spark that sets an entire community on fire? Emma came home from the hospital on a bright Saturday morning, and the whole town seemed to exhale with relief. Cards and flowers and casseroles filled the apartment. Children from Emma's school drew get well pictures. The Thursday Kitchen regulars organized a prayer chain that reached 3 counties. But it was what happened next that nobody expected. A reporter from the county newspaper named Sarah Chin had been coming to the Thursday Kitchen for weeks. Not for a story, but because she was lonely, and the food was good, and something about the place made her feel less alone. When she heard about Emma and William and the Bible, and the chain of events that started with a slice of free pie on a stormy night, she knew she had to write it down. The article ran the following Wednesday under the headline, "The Chain of Kindness, How One Act of Grace Changed a Town." It went viral within 48 hours. Suddenly, Millfield, Ohio was in the national news. Donations poured into the church from every state in the country. Volunteers called from cities Grace had never heard of, asking how they could start their own community kitchens. Churches across America reached out wanting to replicate the model. But the story that captured the nation's heart was William's. As the article spread, people began coming forward with their own William stories. A woman in Kentucky said a man matching his description had appeared at her husband's funeral and left an envelope with exactly enough money to save their home. A pastor in Georgia said William had shown up unannounced at his church during the lowest point of his ministry and spoke words that changed everything. A veteran in Texas said William had sat with him in a VA hospital waiting room and talked him out of giving up. Grace needed to know the truth. She did some research and discovered that William Hart had been a brilliant pediatric surgeon who practiced in Millfield 30 years ago. He had been married to a woman named Ruth who died young from cancer. After her death, he sold everything, left medicine, and disappeared. For 3 decades, he had been traveling the country with nothing but a worn Bible and whatever money he could give away, showing up in the lives of people at their lowest moments. When Grace finally asked him why, William's answer was simple. When I lost Ruth, I wanted to die. A stranger found me on the worst night of my life and showed me that God was still there. I have spent every day since then trying to be that stranger for someone else. That is all any of us can do, Grace. Receive the grace and pass it on. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4 says, God comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. William had lived that verse with every breath, and now so had Grace. What if the end of your story is actually the beginning of someone else's miracle? 1 year had passed since the night. Grace sat alone in an empty diner, begging God for a sign. She barely recognized her own life now. Emma was healthy and thriving, running through the wheat fields behind the church after school, laughing the way only a child who feels completely safe can laugh. Grace had been promoted to the town's social services coordinator, a position the community created specifically for her, and she spent her days connecting people in need with people who could help. The Thursday Kitchen had become the Heart Kitchen Network, spreading to 11 towns across Ohio and still growing. William still appeared from time to time, never on a schedule, never with any warning. He would show up at the kitchen, eat quietly, leave a note of encouragement for Grace, and vanish again. She had stopped trying to understand it. Some things are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be received with gratitude and passed forward with faith. It was on another Thursday night, almost exactly 1 year to the day from when this all began, that Grace found herself driving through a rainstorm on a county road she did not usually take. She could not explain why she had turned down this road. Something had simply told her to go this way. Through the rain, she spotted a small roadside cafe with a single light on inside. She pulled over and walked in. Behind the counter was a young man, maybe 28, with red eyes and slumped shoulders. The cafe was empty. Papers that looked like medical bills were spread across the counter. He looked up at her with the hollow expression of someone who had run out of reasons to keep going. Grace ordered a cup of coffee and sat quietly. She did not say much. She asked his name. Marcus. She asked about the cafe. Family business. Barely surviving. She asked about the papers. His wife. Stage 2. Treatment they could not afford. She listened the way William had listened to her. Present. Unhurried. As if he were the only person in the world who mattered. When she finished her coffee, Grace stood up and left a generous tip. She walked toward the door, then stopped. She reached into her bag and pulled out the worn leather Bible. William's Bible. The one that had changed her life. She had been carrying it every day for a year, and she knew with absolute certainty that tonight was the reason why. She walked back and placed it gently on the counter in front of Marcus. Open it when you are ready, she said. Everything you need is inside. She turned and walked into the rain. Inside the Bible, tucked between the pages of Matthew chapter 10, Marcus would find a note in Grace's handwriting. God's love has no end. Your story is just beginning. Freely you have received, freely give. The camera pulls back slowly through the rain-streaked window of the cafe. Inside, a young man opens an old Bible and begins to read. Outside, a woman drives away into the storm with a quiet smile, knowing that the chain of faith has just added another link. And somewhere on a dark road in America, an old man in a faded military jacket is walking toward the next person who needs to know that they are not alone. Because that is how God works. Not always in thunder, not always in miracles that shake the earth. Sometimes he works through a slice of pie offered to a stranger, through a Bible left on a table, through a life that was broken and rebuilt and then given away. Matthew chapter 10, verse 8. Freely you have received, freely give. And the chain of grace continues.